We start migrating, grab a chair. Hey, sure. Hey, Liz, do you mind grabbing the lights? All right, everybody. I am super excited for tonight's talk. We have Emily Stoffel. She works at a company that makes a database that you might be familiar with, MongoDB, a little bit. So the M and mean. She's also a good friend of mine, and she's an adjunct professor at Columbia, as well as engineer at Mongo. And she's currently, luckily, in New York from Germany. And so I was lucky enough to ask her to come here and give a talk about not only MongoDB, but what it's like contributing to open source. Because I know a lot of you ask me, hey, how do I get into open source? And it's a very broad question, a lot of different answers. And Emily maintains the open source driver for MongoDB, so she's thought about it from the other side. So she'll talk a little bit about what she does, and then any questions you have about contributing to open source, Emily will know 1,000 more times than anyone else that you could possibly find out there. So without further ado, Emily Stoffel.
Thanks. So I don't have any slides. I just wanted to talk more casually about what I do, so we can have a discussion. You can ask me questions. But before I talk specifically about maintaining an open source project, I wanted to go over what I actually work on, so you have a little bit more context as to what code I'm maintaining and what kinds of contributions I hope for and what kinds of contributions I actually get. So you're all familiar with MongoDB. You've used MongoDB, and you've used it with JavaScript, right? And when you use it with JavaScript, you download a, do you use it with a framework, or do you download a specific package okay, you use Mongoose, all right. So do you know what a driver, should I explain what a driver is? Do you want me to explain what a driver is and also what Mongoose is? Because there are kind of 3 levels here. So there's the database. The database is, in the case of MongoDB, it's a process that runs on some computer somewhere or on your own computer. It's implemented in C++, so you can look at the source code for MongoDB. Has anybody done this? Have you looked at the source code at all? So MongoDB is in this this repository, and all this code is written in C++, and it's basically what a database does primarily is knows how to take in data and stock it on a computer in the most efficient way possible to allow further additions to that data or additions to that data set and reads from that data set to happen in the most optimal way possible. And then there are a lot of other levels to that. Like you can, in some databases, and in the case of MongoDB, use the actual code itself to start up a cluster. So like if you have a live application, you're not going to just have one server running with all of your data. You're going to have redundancy so that if one server goes down, you have other servers that can take over for that server that goes down. Because if data is not available, then nobody can use your web application. Money is lost. Businesses can crash if data is not available. So in MongoDB, you might have heard of replica sets and sharded clusters in the context of MongoDB. So MongoDB can be started as a single server, or you can start a replica set, which is where you have one primary node and up to 49 secondary nodes, and they all replicate from the primary node. The primary is the only server in this set that can take new data, and then all the other ones replicate from that primary node. And reads can happen from any secondary or any primary. And when you read from a secondary, you understand that there might be some lag, so you might not see the immediate changes to the primary. Then it also has something called a sharded cluster, which you can start with MongoDB, and that's essentially, not going into too much detail, that's when you have multiple replica sets and you divide your data between all of these replica sets. So all of that code is written in this repository in C++. So you start this server, it's a process. Let's just, like, for the sake of simplicity, just assume that we're starting a single server. So there's a single process running on a single machine or your own machine. And you have an application that's written in any language, an application that's written in Java, in Python, in Ruby, in JavaScript, in Haskell, in Erlang, in anything. And this application needs to be able to make connections to the database, which is a process written in C++, and know how to send messages, what format the messages should be sent in to this database, and know how to interpret and read the responses coming back from the database. So there are like two elements to that. It's like interpretation and also reading the actual messages. So in order to do this, like, the database is dumb. It doesn't know, it's dumb in the sense that it doesn't know who's talking to it. It only can understand one language. And that one language is called the wire protocol. It's kind of like HTTP, where there's a protocol or a certain contract of messages that are going back and forth from an application to MongoDB. And MongoDB can only parse these specific defined messages and only sends defined messages back. So that's all documented by, you can look at this later on if you want. It's called the wire protocol. And I can show you, this is an introduction. But so this will show you that, like, every message will have a header. It's like HTTP. And there are different codes that are interpreted in different ways. And so this whole language of the database needs to be interpreted and read by your application, which is written in any language. So the bit of code that does all of that is called the driver. So when you have an application written in, I'll talk about Ruby because that's the thing I know best. If you have an application written in Ruby, somewhere, somehow, there has to be a bit of code that takes a Ruby data structure, in most cases is a hash, and serializes it into some kind of binary data that has this format that is sent to a socket, on a socket, sent to the server, and interpreted on the server's end and deserialized into something the server can do something with, whether it's data, whether it's an update operation to data that exists already, whether it's an authentication like credentials, or whether it's a command that says you should like change your, like some kind of admin command, or you want to get information on the state of the database process. And then the server will respond, when I say server, it's the MongoDB. The MongoDB will respond back to the application with this binary data in a specific format. And then the driver, the bit of code, takes that message and interprets it, or reads it, deserializes it into its own language data structures. In the case of Ruby, it would be a hash. Or we use, in the driver, we have classes, obviously, for like, because it's object-oriented. And then those messages will be interpreted by the driver to be something or returned to the user. So that's the driver. That's the thing that is, it's very low level. Low level means like as close to the network layer in this sense as possible. So the driver is the actual code that sends messages on the socket, reads messages from the socket. The driver also knows about the state of your MongoDB cluster. So if you have, as I said before, a replica set, which is where you have one primary node, and then, and when I say node, it's a server, because they'll start different MongoDB processes and call them nodes, or server, probably a more accurate word. So when you have different servers, the driver needs to know if I have a write, if I have new data, I need to send it to the primary in a replica set. I can't send it to a secondary, otherwise the secondary will return an error and say, I can't write data to myself. You can only write to the primary. The driver keeps track of who the primary is. And then in the case that the primary goes down, like someone unplugs your server in the data center and another primary is elected from your replica set, the driver has to pick up on those changes and allow your application to continue sending new data, and just automatically it's called failover, so failover to the new server that's now available for writes. So that is kind of the primary responsibility of the driver. It doesn't do anything with business logic. So in your, so you're using Mongoose, and are you using a framework with Mongoose? Or you're just using Mongoose to, are you using like a web framework? or no? Oh, okay, yeah. So Mongoose allows you to define relationships between objects, right, or classes in your code, and allows you to give your classes a schema, right? So you'll have attributes for a particular entity, whatever it is. So if you have a user, the user will have attributes like first name, last name, email, and then a user might have a collection of books, for example, if you're creating a library, and there's a relationship created between a user and books. And that relationship is defined in something that's like one more level up from the driver, and that's called, we call it an ODM, which is an object document mapper, but it's, you're nodding, you probably know this term. So object relational mapper is the one that you would use for a relational database, but MongoDB is a document-oriented database, so we say ODM instead of ORM. Mongoose is, so it's one layer up. So what Mongoose allows you to do is create relationships using a particular language or DSL to, between objects. And then once it comes to the level where it actually wants to send that data to the server, that's where the driver steps in, takes the data structures that you've created representing these entities, and then turns them into binary data to send to the server. And so this kind of layering exists in many languages, if it makes sense for that language. So it makes sense in object-oriented languages because we create classes and we create entities called objects and then relationships between objects. So that makes sense in Ruby. I maintain the Ruby driver at MongoDB, and I also maintain the ODM, which is called Mongoid, as of recently. It was written, so Mongoid is to Mongoose as Ruby is to Node, is to Node. So Mongoid is the ODM that you use if you're using Ruby and you need an ODM. There's another one called MongoMapper, but it's kind of lost popularity over the last couple of years. And so what Mongoid does is it allows you, again, like Mongoose, to define a kind of schema and relationships between the objects that you're using in your application. So you can use this DSL to create business logic, and then Mongoid handles all of that, and then at the driver level, it'll take Ruby hashes, data structure, and convert it into binary. So does that make sense, like what all these pieces are? In PHP, there is also this kind of layering. I don't think PHP is object-oriented, but they have an ODM called Doctrine, which is like Mongoid. They also have a driver. What other? I know Java has, it's called Morphia, which is a ODM, and then there's some other ones out there. I think Python has one, but it's not very popular. I'm not sure. It's being recorded, so I'm going to stop talking now. Anyway, so getting back to the theme at hand, which is contributing to open source. All of my work is open source. Every single line of code I write is public, including my code reviews. So I'll explain a little bit about the process of writing or like actually maintaining an open source project. And then I'll talk to you about my perspective as a maintainer, what it means what happens when I get a pull request and kind of my perspective on that. And if you're interested in contributing to open source, I have a list of do's and don'ts, so they might not be things that are obvious to you if you've never contributed to an open source project before or maintained one. And I think they're just things that I've learned over the last 3 years as someone who works on open source. And I kind of love getting pull requests, but sometimes I don't always love it because it can be extra work, and you don't want people to feel like they're not making valuable contributions. So it's like a fine line between encouraging contribution, encouraging people to look at your project because it is public and open. You want to be positive about people looking at your code and contributing, but sometimes people are just looking for a little green square in their GitHub or something, you know. So so the Ruby team at MongoDB our workflow. Okay, so the Ruby team is like me and this one other guy. So over the last year and a half, I've been working with someone named Duran Jordan, who actually wrote Mongoid 7 years ago, and we hired him about we hired him 2 years ago to work on building a completely new Ruby driver and getting Mongoid to use the new Ruby driver, because in the past it was using its own driver. And so when I say the Ruby team, it's a very small team. There are only 2 of us, and that's why this process works for us. But if you had a bigger team, it probably wouldn't really work like this. So do you guys do code reviews here? Do you review each other's code? Do you use a tool for that, or what do you do for that? You just like mail each other files or something?
Joe likes to delete our whole, like remove all the commits and then put it back, and then you can comment line by line on GitHub. Never mind.
Okay. All right. Well, so the way we work is I have my own fork of the Ruby driver, and when I'm working on a particular feature or fixing a bug, I'll create a new branch in my fork, and I'll work on there, and I'll always push up to GitHub. Like, I just use that. It's public. Anybody can look at the work I do every day. And then once it's ready to be reviewed by my colleague Durin, or if in some cases, if I'm implementing some kind of specification that there's someone else on the driver's team who knows more about it, or knows who has written this specification, for example, I'll tag that person so they can actually look at my code. But in most cases, it's just Durin and me. And so then I'll push all of it up. We use Jira. If you're familiar with that, it's a project management tool to track all of our work and all of our tasks and tickets and bugs. And when people log bugs against the Ruby driver, they'll open a ticket in Jira. But we also use Jira for creating new features and tracking. Like, I create tickets in there too for myself. And I'll always write the name of the ticket in the pull request and all the commits I put in the pull request, so that they all show up in the comments of the Jira ticket. So it's easy for tracking into the future, even like beyond my employment at MongoDB. Someone can like easily look back and see where it's much easier than using Git blame to track the comments in the Jira ticket. So I'll open a pull request against the main Ruby driver, the MongoDB Ruby driver repo, and then when that happens, usually Durin will see it and know that or get an email notification that I've opened that, and he'll just go in and code review. I don't even need to ask him. Otherwise, I'll just tag him, or I'll send him an email and ask him to review it. And so what that looks like is, so today, like this is the Ruby driver repo on GitHub in the MongoDB organization, so this is not my fork. And at any given point, this is a lot of pull requests for us. Usually we only have like 3 or 4 going, but today I don't. So yeah, I actually don't have any open that I've done, but this is, this is a good example. So I have someone doing a new grad doing a rotation on my team. So I have someone working now with me who was working on Python before and who's learning Ruby. And so today she opened a pull request, and so we can use her example because that's how I would work also. So in her GitHub, she has a repository for the Ruby driver, which is her fork. Her repository is here. So this is her fork, and she had a branch probably called Ruby 839. No. Oh, she called it. Oh, so she should have called it Ruby-1034, but it's her personal fork, so that doesn't really matter. And so she was working on this over the last couple of days, and then she opened a pull request when she was ready for me to review it. And then today I was code reviewing the pull request, and I just made some suggestions for syntax because she's new to Ruby, so I wanted to show her how we normally did things stylistically. And this is our own workflow. This is not an external contributor to the driver. And then once she fixes those, she'll let me know, and then I'll say like looks good to me, and then I'll merge it in. So that's like our own process, and because all of this is public, anybody else who's interested could follow along with the code review and make their own comments. I remember I recently, as I said, I'm working on Mongoid, And I opened a pull request recently, and there's like just random guy in Ukraine like code reviewing it. That was, wait, what was it? I don't remember which one it was, but anyway, anybody can jump in and make comments if they want, and usually they're productive. So, okay, so let's go to this. Today I went through and I tried to think of, as I said, all of the like good things and bad things about contributing to an open source project, and tried to find example pull requests where someone has illustrates that one thing. And I guess, so if you were to contribute to an open source project, and it would be a very similar process to what we actually do internally, so the thing that I just described, you would fork steps. So what you would do is you would fork the project. So if you were interested in contributing to the Ruby driver, you would fork the Ruby driver project. So you would get that whole repo under your own name in GitHub. Then you would create a branch. So I wouldn't commit against master in your own fork, because you always want to keep your you're familiar with Git, right? You all use Git. So so let's say like I have the Ruby driver, and I'm working on the Ruby driver. I make commits to master. I'll merge in stuff, and I keep doing my own work. You're working on your fork, and you always want your master to be updated with my master. You don't want to write your own changes as you're developing to your master. Otherwise, it'll get really messy when you try to bring in the changes that I'm doing on the original Ruby driver repo. So when you're working on your fork and you want to create some code that could potentially become a pull request against the original repository, the upstream, you'll want to create a feature branch so that you can always keep your master updated with that and resolve all the conflicts yourself when you rebase. So definitely create a branch. It'll be easier for you, unless you're writing the feature in 5 minutes and submitting the pull request. But it's better to create a branch. And then you code against this branch, and you push it up to GitHub. Make sure you run the test. So if it's a established package in Node or established gem in Ruby, there will be tests. I don't think anybody doesn't have tests. So make sure you run their tests. Look at their testing environment to see what versions of Ruby they test against, or versions of the language they test against. If it's a database, see what database versions they test against, because your tests may pass on one version of your language but not on others. So if they were to get the pull request, they're going to see whether or not it passes all of their tests on their matrix. So to give you an example, Travis CI is where we use Jenkins, which is a testing continuous integration platform, as well as Travis. Travis we use because it can be hooked into GitHub. So when you have, so I can use this example of my colleague submitting this pull request against the driver. So she submit this pull request against the driver today. And then, so I was looking at it, and then I was like, oh, that's weird that it failed our tests. So this is where Travis is hooked into GitHub. And so I went and I looked at Travis, and I saw that her tests were failing. I mean, her code was failing our tests for everything. And it does pass on the most recent version of Ruby. So we probably should update our Travis, but basically on her local machine it was passing because she was using the most recent version of Ruby. But the reason it's not passing in older versions of Ruby is because there's this one syntax thing that she was doing that's a new feature, a new way of doing things in Ruby. And because she's new to Ruby, she, I guess, was just looking at the most recent documentation, which makes total sense. But I'm showing you this because if you're a contributor to an open source project, if you're contributing to an open source project, look at their testing, their continuous integration, and see what they're testing against. And make sure you don't have to do like all of that, but just look at and say, oh, they're testing against 1.9.3 Ruby, 2.1, 2.0, 2.2. They're also testing in JRuby, so test on JRuby also. Otherwise, the maintainer is not going to merge your code unless it passes their tests. So that's something you definitely want to make sure, and that's something you can do. So save yourself the back and forth with the maintainer and make sure they pass, or like make sure you run the tests and run the tests according to their matrix. What's really awesome for us also, if as a maintainer, is if you tie the pull request back to some kind of ticket in the project management platform they use. So if you open a pull request against a project and it's a new feature or a bug fix or whatever it is, it's really helpful to track that by some kind of description in the project management software so that the maintainer can see the justification for it. And if it's a bug, it'll be a lot easier for them to have some code that reproduces the bug you're seeing and then connect it back to the pull request that you're submitting. And that helps your case a lot, that like proves that it needs to be merged into the actual repository. So I'm going to go back up to the top and talk about the different kinds of contributions. And there might be more, but this is just what I could think of today. So we get a lot of documentation fixes, which are basically people finding a spell error and fixing that, or noticing that we didn't document one of the params to a method, or arguments to a method or function. So those are kind of simple, and in some cases, I always roll my eyes when I get a pull request like that, because a lot of times it's just someone who wants to like have a green square on GitHub and just get some fame or something. But it is helpful, and I'm guilty of making spell corrections to other repos too. Yeah, I tried to find right before I started talking, my amazing commits to the Python driver have been basically like changing, like making a spell correction. But it's kind of a joke, so I'm allowed to do that. So that's one. Those are always welcome because documentation is really, really important. So I'm sure you'll know from learning how to code or being in an educational environment now, like documentation is so useful. And as you're looking at source code and as you're learning how to code or as you're looking at other people's code, documentation is completely essential because otherwise people's code won't make sense. The other kind is configuration changes. So I have an example here of something someone did. So someone was looking at our Travis matrix, which is this thing that I just showed you, and they noticed that we weren't testing the most recent version of Ruby, or there's some version of Ruby they wanted to add to it. So they added to our Travis YAML file. And like that's helpful too, because sometimes like I'm working on a lot of different repos at once, so it's really helpful when someone can do something like this, because I sometimes don't even remember to do some maintenance in some places. So that's very welcome contribution. Bug fixes. So as I said before, if you find a bug, usually the perfect contributor would be someone who finds a bug, opens a ticket in Jira for us, shows me how to reproduce the bug, and then says, I looked through your code and I found that the error's on this line, and I'm opening this pull request to fix it. That's like perfect. So, and then they put like the Ruby dash serial number in their pull request. That would be so easy and so helpful for me to track it in the future and to investigate or see whether or not the pull request is justified and if I should merge it in. So I have an example of that. We have, there's one guy over the last couple of months who was really, really helpful with doing this. He is in Greece, and he would, is this the guy? Oh no, it's someone else. But I have one of his examples also. This is an example of someone who found a bug, and he, what he did was exactly that. So he found this bug where there's something with SSL configurations, doesn't really matter, but he opened a ticket in Jira and he linked it here, and then he provided the fix for it with a test. And so for me, I looked at it and I said, okay, this changed the code. He's justifying it with a test here. I can see it actually is a bug, and now it's working with this test. So what I can do is I can take this test and run it against the driver without the change he made and see that it actually is a bug. And then I can also see the justification in the Jira ticket. And unfortunately for him in this case, I said it was already fixed, but it wasn't actually released yet. So he found this bug himself in a version of the driver I had released. And so he reported it, but if he was a super contributor, he would have looked through our Jira tickets and found that this bug already existed, and not open this ticket, but basically that's fine. So yeah, I responded, I closed it, I didn't merge it, I just said it was fixed, and I showed him the commit just so he could like see. I don't know if I did the same thing he did. Yeah. Yeah, so, but this is a good contribution if you find a bug. It's really helpful to the maintainer. New features, that's a hard one because I don't think I have a accurate perspective on, or way of handling new features in the driver, because the drivers to MongoDB are the interface to the server. So you can't send any messages to the server unless you have some kind of driver that serializes and deserializes messages and knows the wire protocol, which I explained in the beginning, which is the format of messages that you send to the server. So we, as a drivers team, we're like, I'm kind of an open source contributor, or maintainer, but not really, because I'm paid by a company to work on this. So I'm not. A lot of people who are open source maintainers just do it in their free time on the weekend or at night. So they don't have any kind of like company behind them that requires they adhere to certain specifications, or they don't have a lot of documentation and that they have to, or I guess like requirements by some kind of company behind them. But I do. So I work on this drivers team. We're about 22 people. We maintain 9 drivers across the 22 of us. And we all write specifications for certain features, and we have certain things we have to support in different server versions, and we have a lot of requirements for our code. So we can't just arbitrarily add new features. A lot of open source projects are a little bit more organic, where if a new feature is requested by a certain number of users, the maintainer will probably merge in that new feature, and there's not so much of a limitation around what they can actually add to the code base. And so sometimes like people will want to add new features to the code base, and I can't, because I have all these specs I have to adhere to or comply with, and I can't just arbitrarily like add stuff to the code base. But occasionally people will bring up a really good point where they would like to, oh yeah, we had a pull request recently, I can show you, where someone basically wanted a way to access, let's see if I can find it. He wanted, oh, this one, yeah. So this is really simple, and it's kind of a new feature, but basically he wanted to be able to call, he had a justification actually in his explanation. He said, I would like to use collections as an instance method of Mongo client. So in order to get the list of collections that you have in your database, you'd have to do client.database.collections, and he wanted to be able to just do client.collections. And so he added this little bit of code to allow him to do that, so that was kind of a new feature. And for me, that's totally fine. Like that's something that helps the user out, that makes his code a little bit cleaner, and I'm sure it'll be easier for a lot of other people to just have more direct access to the list of collections. And so you can actually see an example here of how I would respond to that. So I said, this is a good idea, but would you mind adding a test? And I told him where to add it, so you didn't have to like look through my code to find where that would go. And then he added it, and then I merged it. So I won't, as a maintainer, I'll never merge something unless there's a test. And sometimes, because our test framework is, we use RSpec, which is a really popular Ruby testing framework. And in the case that the user, like, if it's a really complicated test, like has to do with, if there's some kind of particular behavior you're testing, like failover where like a primary node goes down and you need to check some state, sometimes I'll just like merge it in and then write the test myself, because I don't want to waste the contributor's time. But that's really important for me to see when you submit a pull request, is to have a test there too, because as I said, that adds to the justification. So that's new features, which I think in my case, as I said, is a little bit more rigid and less accepting of contributions, but most other open source projects are probably a little bit more open to that. our own code reviews. So I showed you an example of that. That's part of our workflow. That's how we do code reviews. And I really like it. I like having code reviews public so that people can potentially look at them and make their own comments. And because I love criticism, and I'm not going to get any better if nobody's looking at my code. Then improvements. So let's look at these. I forgot what I said. Oh yeah, so someone was looking through our code and he said that, yeah, so instead of raising an error, he wanted this method to return false. So it wouldn't stop, it wouldn't raise an error in his application, it would just return some state. And this was really helpful also, where he had 2 tickets that he logged against the Ruby driver that pointed out situations in which this exception would be raised, and it was too insignificant for it to actually halt, to raise an exception in his application and stop whatever he was doing. So he said it would be better, this would be an improvement, it would be better if it actually had this behavior. And in this case, actually, I had refactored this code kind of in the meantime, and it wasn't something I really wanted to merge in, but I had tracked in another ticket how I changed this behavior, so I think it resolved the 2 tickets he had put here, but I didn't, as I said in the beginning, I want to encourage people to contribute, so I wasn't like, no thanks, close. I said like, thanks for this, but we actually decided to take another approach. And you want to always show that you appreciate people contributing. And then this was another improvement where, what did he do? Yeah, I don't know. So this was really useful. This guy works for Compose.io, if you know what that is. It's a hosted MongoDB. It's a company that used to be MongoHQ, if you've heard of that. It's hosted MongoDB instances. So it's now called Compose.io, and he was really helpful over the last year in testing the new driver that we released in March. And I would like chat with him every day, and he would like test stuff, and it was really helpful. So I always really liked getting pull requests from him because it would point out different parts of the code that could be improved. So I went over the steps to open a pull request. So these are different types of pull requests, as I said, and I guess the most important as a maintainer is I want to see justification, I want to see explanation, a test is amazing, and if you can open a ticket, that's really useful also. So sometimes people think code speaks for itself, but it really doesn't. It's really difficult to look at someone's code and tell what they're thinking. So any kind of explanation you can provide around it is really useful for the maintainer and helps your case if it's something you want to get merged in. So general list of do's and don'ts, add tests, follow style. In Ruby, I'm not sure about JavaScript. I'm not that familiar with JavaScript, but in Ruby there are a lot of different ways of doing the same thing. There are a lot of, as you saw in the pull request my colleague had opened, there's different syntax for defining keys and values in a hash. And she was using the most recent syntax, and I didn't use that syntax anywhere in the driver. So I wrote to her and I was like, yeah, you can see, I said, that syntax doesn't work on older versions of Ruby, and I wanted, I showed her an example of how we actually do it, because I wanted her to follow our style. So like, this is another example. Like usually when you define a key and value, you have a space between the 2 of them. So I said I would put it like this, and then here's an existing example. So you want to make sure as a contributor you're looking at their code and following their style. And she did ask me, do you have a style parser or something? Like I know in Python they have this thing, I don't know, you can run something and it'll point out where your style is not consistent. And we don't have one in Ruby, but I would look at the project you're contributing to and make sure the way you're defining things and the variable naming and all of that is in line with their code, because they will really appreciate consistency in their code style. Add an explanation, open a ticket in the project's ticketing system for tracking. Here's probably another example. Oh, this guy opened this pull request today, I think. Yeah. we're not actually going to merge this in because I'll talk about why when I say don'ts. But this was, this was really good because at the same time I got a ticket and I also got the pull request, so it gave a lot of context. Rebase against master. So remember when I said in your own fork, create a separate feature branch for this code that you're contributing? Make sure that master is always updated right before you submit the pull request. Make sure your master is updated with the upstream master and rebase your feature branch on master to make sure that when tests pass against your pull request, they are actually passing with master and your changes on top. And that's really important. And I won't merge anything. Usually I'll say, we're always actively working on the Ruby driver, so if I get a pull request and then I do any kind of commits to master, I understand you can't always keep your pull request updated with master, but I'll ask the user, the contributor, to rebase so that their code is really just master with their code on top. And check test on whatever CI they're using. So as I said before with Travis, check their matrix and make sure you test against all of that. And in the pull request, a lot of times they'll have a hook at the bottom that will show you whether or not the pull request is passing tests. So like here, it says all checks have failed. And so you would look at this and just see why and make sure you fix that, because they'll ask you to fix it anyway. Have a conversation with the maintainer. So this is the guy who was really helpful over last year. Also, this is the one who was in Greece. He found that we didn't actually support Unix domain sockets in the driver, even though we said we did. And so we just completely ignored it if you had to find a Unix socket, which was kind of dumb. And so he submitted this pull request and said, this is, let me know if I'm on the right track. What do you think? And this was even before he added tests. And then I guess I commented, and I suggested a little bit of a difference. And I said, feel free to add tests. And so after we had the conversation, I said, add tests. And then he added some. And he found there was an issue with JRuby when he wrote the tests. So that's good that he wrote tests. And then he resolved them, which was cool. And then we merged it in. So this is kind of the perfect pull request. And submit from a feature branch, add documentation too. So I think maybe, did you do that here? No, he didn't write a new method, so he didn't have to write documentation, but always add documentation. That goes along with their style too. If they have documentation, then you should follow what kind of documentation they use. So don'ts. So the reason we didn't merge the pull request that the person opened today was because it was a problem he was seeing in his own app that he realized it was an exception that was being raised pretty frequently from the driver. So he opened a pull request to kind of silence the exception in certain situations. And so that only really benefited his app. It wasn't totally silly, but he didn't really think about the whole picture, and if you silence this one exception, then you're not going to see it in situations when it's actually really a problem. And so as a contributor, you should really think about, am I kind of hacking a solution for my own problem, or is this something that everybody else can benefit from? So especially if it's a new feature, really think about, is this something I specifically want, or is this a convenience that will be useful to a lot of people? And as a maintainer, you don't want to just merge in anything that people want. You want to keep your code base pretty focused and clean. So the broader your solution is, or the more general your new feature is, the better, so that more people can use it. It's not just one specific feature. And don't add completely insignificant things just to say you contribute to open source. Because that's I don't know. Submit code without tests. I think I said that a couple of times. And then don't take it personally if it's not merged. So as I showed you before, someone had suggested a certain solution to a problem, and it wasn't exactly what we wanted in the driver, but we really appreciate that he brought that problem up. So don't take it personally, or don't feel like your code's not good. it's sometimes just not really like what the maintainer wants in the code base, or it's not the approach that they would have taken. And yeah, so there was that example. And then this one was, oh yeah, so this one is another example where this user, so it's the guy that I showed you the perfect pull request from before, he wanted to change this. And I mean, he wouldn't really have known this, but this is my manager. He said this is actually related to a Python ticket that there's a certain problem on Windows. And he said, oh, I didn't know that. And so like, shouldn't take that personally. There's like certain things that you do in code bases that are very specific that you might not have a whole history for. So sometimes it's just like your code's not relevant, or it's missing some part of the picture that you wouldn't have seen. And that's pretty much it for the things that I wanted to share with you. My colleague Jeremy, who maintains Doctrine, which is the Mongoid equivalent for PHP, has these slides. I can share this just with you too later if you want. He has these slides about being a good open source software contributor. And it goes into a little bit more detail with more examples. And I asked him, he's really funny. And I asked him, what's the first thing that goes through your mind when you get a pull request? And he was like, I don't really want to share it with you, but no, he said, I don't know, but this is what it's like waiting for your pull request to get merged, because like contributors are so excited to contribute, and sometimes we're really slow with responding, and then from the other side, sometimes people are like, are you listening to me? So anyway, do you have any questions about anything, about MongoDB? I don't know if we have a lot of time, or...
Yeah, I think we can take like 4 or 5 questions.
Yeah, so any questions about MongoDB,
If you have
about
questions,
working on open source?
Let me turn this down a bit.
Yeah, if you have questions, raise your hand and I'll pass you the mic.
You said that the Ruby driver is kind of like what sits between the Mongo server and Mongoid.
Yeah.
But you didn't. Does Mongoose do its own like driver stuff, or is there something in that layer?
So you don't absolutely need an ODM like Mongoose or Mongoid to make requests to the server or send messages and get responses back from the server. You can use the driver raw. It's just the difference is that when you use the driver in whatever language you're writing in, it's sending a pure data. You're creating pure data structures and are then serialized into binary data that's sent to the server. What you get with the ODM is more logic. So like you have entities, as I said, with relationships between them. So in the case of Mongoose, you have Mongoose is the layer above with all of the logic, and then there's actually a node driver underneath that it uses. So it's the same exact thing. Like that layering exists for all of the languages. Like there's a driver. We have 9 of them, so it's like Python, C, C++, Ruby, Java, Scala, Perl. Who else? I'm trying to think of all my colleagues. Node. Did I say Node? Node. Who am I forgetting? Oh, C#. Yeah, and .NET. So those are all drivers, and then there are a myriad of ODMs that sit on top of them. Like you can have different ODMs for the drivers. You can also have different drivers. We have some community drivers. But I think the driver code is kind of difficult to write because it's so specific to MongoDB. It's not like writing ODM code is a little bit more general. It's really just dealing with your language and then using the driver that knows, the driver is kind of the keeper of all the like weirdness of MongoDB and all of the specifications of the protocol that you use to talk to the server. So
you have a colleague doing node driver stuff?
Yeah. So specifically for Node, his name is Christian Valum. He is half Norwegian, half Spanish, and he lives in the north of Spain. So you can see it on GitHub. So I can show you. I think it's called Mongo Node Driver. I could be wrong. Maybe it has its own name. Node MongoDB native. So this is Christian, and this is the equivalent of the Ruby driver in Node. So this is, he does the same thing as I do, just for Node. And then Mongoose actually was written by someone named what's his name? Aaron Heckman. You might have seen his name in the code if you've ever looked at it. And he worked for MongoDB for a while. We hired him to work on Mongoose, supported by us. And then he went to another company, and I think Mongoose is kind of like an unofficial project of ours. And we have someone contributing to it because we have a lot of knowledge now internally at MongoDB about how Mongoose works. I think it's officially still an open source project. Christian doesn't write that code at all. He just worked on the driver.
How closely do you follow new features being added to other drivers and add them to ones that you're working on, or the Ruby one in this case?
So that's a good question. We've been talking about that a lot over the last year because we're so proud of ourselves. The drivers team historically is comprised of a bunch of open source projects that were developed independently by open source software engineers who didn't work for MongoDB. And historically, MongoDB was started in 2007, and when it grew and it realized that it wanted to actually support and pay people to work on the drivers, the company hired the people, the open source maintain, like Christian's one of them. He wrote the driver just in his own time because I think he was working for a company using MongoDB and he wanted to write the Node driver for it. So he wrote the driver, and then MongoDB hired him to be paid to work on the driver. So for the first couple years of MongoDB Inc., like the company's life, we had this drivers team that was just we were all independent. We had our own code bases, and many of us had actually written the code ourselves before we worked for the company. But over the last 2 years, MongoDB has grown up a lot as a company. We've become bigger in size and also bigger in, reputation in the industry. And we've had to kind of become a little bit more, for lack of a better word, professional with how we do things. So all of the drivers rewrote their drivers, and at the same time, we wrote specifications for all the features. So to answer your question, I don't have to follow the new features in other drivers because anytime a new feature is added, we think about all the drivers as one single product now. It is the interface to MongoDB. We're not a set of diverse drivers anymore that we all kind of did our own thing before, and it was it was really difficult for our support team and for our sales team to talk about the drivers consistently. So if you can imagine, someone on sales would go and talk to a company and try to sell a contract for support for MongoDB, and they'd say like, oh yeah, sure, like I'll use MongoDB, but like, does your driver support this feature? And they'd be like, well, what language are you using? And a lot of companies use a lot of different languages. So if you've worked for a bank, like they'll have Java, they'll have Ruby, they'll have Python scripts, and they all use a driver to talk to the same database in some cases. So we needed a way for the entire drivers team to kind of get their act together and like be a little bit more consistent about what features they had. So now we have, actually this is a good thing to show. We have a specifications repo on GitHub where we put all of the specifications for features. And not all features are in here because this is an effort that we've started putting a lot of time into over the last 1.5 years, 2 years. And so you won't see every aspect of the driver in here, but we're slowly adding to it. So core things like, I guess a good example would be CRUD. So CRUD is create, read, update, delete. So in here, we define an API for how to create, read, update, delete data in the database. And it's pretty general. But the API is spelled out. So every driver, when they rewrote their driver, followed this specification and has all of these elements, all of the API elements, and all of the options and everything. So now we don't have to compare ourselves to, I don't have to compare the Ruby driver to any other driver. We all know that we follow this spec. That's why, that goes back to why I said like adding new features is not that easy, because we want to maintain consistency across all of the drivers. And that's why my open source project is a little bit different from others. It's not as flexible and not as organic. Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot more, I guess, like popularity in open source projects, or in terms of like people noticing them in a way. And I was wondering, is there any like negative sides to open source that you feel that you've noticed ever since being so publicly, your code base being so public in the open?
I guess it's been so long since I worked on closed source. It's hard to make a comparison, but I think one thing that comes to mind is when you're working on closed source, you don't really have to think about breaking other people's code. You can really focus on the functionality of your code. And in Ruby in particular, I know in Java, if anybody is programming Java, you can have elements of your code that as a user of that code you cannot access. You can't call certain elements of the API because it's private. In Ruby, we don't really have that. We can have private methods on a class, but we can't have private classes. So you can't, every class I write in the driver can be instantiated by a user. So that means that any internal changes to the driver, I can never break the API. I can never make little changes that people like hook into the driver and use methods they're not supposed to if they're creating some kind of agent that does like monitoring on their server or something. And so I'd say like the negative is that sometimes I will write roundabout code that's not as direct or clean as I would like, just because I can't break API ever. And I don't have any protection against people using every element of my code. So sometimes, sometimes I wish that I could just like delete stuff. Like deprecation's a really good example. Yeah, sometimes there are methods that aren't useful anymore in the driver, and I just want to delete them, but I can't. I have to leave them there just in case someone's still using them in their own code. So your code becomes like a little bit messy, like more messy than you would like it, and that's kind of annoying. Another thing is you're always watched. Like people always like know if you mess up, it's very public. Like I only once released a gem that was broken, and I had to yank it from Ruby Gems, which is NPM for Ruby, so it's like the package manager. And it wasn't a big deal. It's not like people lost data or anything, but it was, it's like embarrassing, you know? But the other side of that is I'm like, your devotion to quality is really, really high because the stakes are really high. Like I don't ever want to experience that again. So I'm like I think I'm really aware. So I'm really aware of every line of code I write, and I make sure to, I don't know, like the quality I think is higher just because I know the stakes are higher. Also, naming of variables, I always make sure to name them really clearly, because if they don't make sense, then nobody's going to understand the code. So it's like, yeah, I think a lot of the negatives are also positives.
I was wondering, have you ever heard of anyone getting their foot in the door in terms like of at MongoDB by doing like perfect pull requests? You know.
I
Certainly couldn't hurt.
think, yeah. I mean, I know people have followed, huh?
I said all you have to do is write a driver.
I know people have been hired through our education platform, like people who have scored perfect on, we have an education, like a code school basically for MongoDB online, and people who have gotten perfect scores on that, we've hired before. The drivers team, I think we've hired people who like built the drivers or ODMs, but it's not. That is a sure way to get yourself noticed, and I haven't seen it happen. But I think like I wouldn't think it's not possible. I think it's if you want to work in the driver's team, there's no better way than to look at the driver code and make a contribution, or and be active.
All right, great. How about time for one more question? Anyone have one last question? I have a similar question to Steven. Is that like what a lot of times people say GitHub profile is like the new resume, or it's good to have an impressive GitHub profile. Like, what does that mean to you when you're looking at other people? Like, what does it mean to have an impressive GitHub profile? For someone who might be not like a driver maintainer.
The real reason I love working on open source is I never ever want to do a technical interview ever again. So GitHub profile. I teach at Columbia, teach a Rails class, and I said to my class in the beginning, they're all really new to Rails. A lot of them are new to programming also, or web programming at least. And I said, make your repo for this class private if you're not comfortable having just anybody who's evaluating you for an internship or a job looking at it. I think that's very true that GitHub profiles are the first place. So I do interviews also at MongoDB for our internship program, and I will always look at their GitHub profile and see what they have there. And it says a lot about you. Like if you have some projects up there that are, if you have a lot of projects up there and they're all like not really anything, they're just like really messy or don't actually, I don't know, sometimes you'll create projects as a little dummy app and just leave it there. And if it's kind of like, I guess it's like seeing someone's in apartment or like their closet. If it's really messy, then do you want to hire them to fold clothes in your store? I don't know. I think it's very true that I take my GitHub profile really seriously, and I look at other people's GitHub profiles. I don't look at LinkedIn. If I'm interviewing someone for an engineering position, I do look at GitHub.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you.
Yeah, I recommend, just last night I was talking to some of the other Flex students, and they were all asking me about, hey, maybe instead of Stackstore, get an open source contribution. And I do recommend it. And I sympathize with that dog. I recently just had a documentation pull request to the Express.js repo, and like I submitted it. It was like literally like 2 lines, and I was like, why isn't everyone stopping and reading my awesome pull request of 2 lines of Markdown? And so I definitely recommend doing that route if you're interested. And I mean, no one's gonna hire me for that particular reason, but it's a great feeling to kind of get at least a few other eyes onto your code from the community. And I think people out there, they're just people. They're not like super. Well, some communities are very mean, right? I don't know.
I didn't want to say this, but one of the negatives of working on open source is people's egos. Sometimes you can have really bad experiences. I think egos get kind of out of control sometimes, and when you type things, you will write things in certain ways that in which you wouldn't necessarily say them. And I think that you have to develop. If you work in open source for a while, you'll probably develop a pretty thick skin for the snarkiness. But I really wish that my tactic is just to be as nice as possible and hope that kind of like bleeds out and people will be nicer. But people aren't always that polite, and sometimes people will criticize your code because it benefits their reputation more than benefiting the code in the end. And I wish open source rhetoric was a little bit more polite in general, but.
So, with that word of encouragement.
Just like, don't take it personally. That's all I have to say. Don't take it personally, ever. But I did want to say, if someone's interested in contributing to the Ruby driver, I have some tickets I need to do for the next server version, and they're pretty simple. Like if you want to talk to me, you can. My email is emily@mongodb, so you can email me if you're interested. As I said, the person's pull request I was showing that was doing a code review, she is a new grad and she's working on some tickets, but I'm sure she would love to like share them if people want to try out contributing.
All right,
So.
very cool. All right, thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you.